In the grim darkness of the far future, there are horrors beyond comprehension. Ancient warriors entombed in walking sarcophagi, savage xenos who live only for war, and sometimes, in the vast uncaring void between stars, these two forces collide in ways that defy imagination. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating and terrifying scenarios in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. What happens when a warband of Orks stumbles upon a Space Marine Dreadnought that has been dormant for 2,000 years? This isn't just a simple tale of combat. It's a story that touches on the deepest horrors of the 40k setting, the nature of consciousness and duty, the unstoppable tide of Ork ingenuity, and the collision of two forces that represent fundamentally different aspects of warfare in the 41st millennium. To understand what unfolds when these forces meet, we need to delve deep into the lore, examining both the tragic existence of dreadnoughts and the chaotic, terrifying brilliance of Ork culture. The scenario begins in darkness, perhaps in the twisted corridors of a space hulk that has drifted through the warp for millennia. Maybe on a forgotten battlefield, where the dust of ages has buried the fallen beneath meters of accumulated debris, or in the ruins of a fortress monastery, long abandoned after some catastrophic defeat, its halls silent, save for the whisper of wind through shattered walls. In this darkness, something waits, something that was once a man, something that has been waiting far, far too long. The nature of the Dreadnought, a prison of flesh and iron. To understand the full horror and significance of what we're discussing, you must first understand what a dreadnought truly is. Most who witness these towering war machines on the battlefield see only the surface, a walking tank, 12 to 15 feet of ceramite-plated fury, bristling with weapons capable of reducing entire squads to paste and ash. They see the heraldry of ancient chapters, the purity seals that flutter in the wind of their passing, the massive power fists that can crush battle tanks like empty ration tins. What they don't see, what they cannot see from the outside, is the truth of what lies within. A dreadnought is not a vehicle. It is a tomb. More specifically, it is a life support system built around the shattered remains of a space marine who should have died, but was instead preserved through a combination of advanced technology and unbreakable duty. When a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced biology and the skills of the chapter's apothecaries cannot save them, when their body is broken beyond any hope of recovery, they face a choice that is no choice at all. They can die with honor, their gene seed harvested to create future generations of warriors. Or they can be interred within a dreadnought chassis to serve the Emperor for centuries or even millennia to come. This is presented as an honor, the greatest of honors, in fact, to continue serving the Emperor even after your body has failed, to become a living weapon, a walking monument to the chapter's glory, to fight on when others have fallen. But ask any dreadnought pilot who retains enough of their humanity to answer honestly, and they will tell you a different story. They will tell you about the horror of waking in absolute darkness, unable to move, unable to feel, connected to a machine through cables that burrow into what remains of your flesh. They will describe the sensation of having your limbs replaced with weapons, your skin with armor plating, your voice with mechanical speakers that turn speech into a grinding rasp. The process of interment is brutal. What remains of the fallen warrior, often little more than a torso, a head, and perhaps fragments of limbs, is surgically connected to a life support sarcophagus. Cables are threaded directly into the nervous system. Chemical baths preserve the organic tissue. Nutrient feeds sustain what's left of bodily function. The sarcophagus itself becomes the pilot's new body, connected through a neural interface that allows them to control the dreadnought's massive frame as if it were their own flesh. But the connection is never perfect. There is always a disconnect, a separation between thought and action that reminds the pilot with every movement that they are no longer truly human. The weapon systems are overwhelming. Where once a space marine might have carried a bolter and a chainsword, the Dreadnought mounts assault cannons, las cannons, missile launchers, heavy flamers, power fists the size of automobiles. The targeting systems feed directly into the pilot's visual cortex, overlaying the world with data streams and firing solutions. The armor is thick enough to shrug off weapons that would obliterate standard infantry. In purely military terms, a Dreadnought represents a massive force multiplier, capable of turning the tide of battles through sheer firepower and resilience. But there is a price. There is always a price. The Dreadnoughts cannot remain active indefinitely. The strain on the pilot's psyche is too great. The sensory deprivation, the isolation, the fundamental wrongness of existing as a consciousness trapped within a machine. All of these factors combine to create an unbearable psychological burden. And so, when a battle is won and a campaign concludes, the Dreadnoughts are returned to the chapter's fortress monastery. The sarcophagus is removed from the chassis and placed in the deep halls, the chambers where the Ancient Ones sleep between wars. And then the pilot is put into stasis. This is where the true horror begins. Because for a Dreadnought, sleep is not rest. It is a void, a darkness so complete that time loses all meaning. Some describe it as dreamless oblivion, a non-existence that swallows years or decades or centuries whole. Others report nightmares that loop endlessly, replaying battles and horrors over and over until reality and nightmare become indistinguishable. The longest-serving Dreadnoughts, those who have been awakened and returned to stasis dozens or hundreds of times over millennia, often lose track of what is real. They wake confused, disoriented, sometimes believing they are still fighting wars that ended thousands of years ago. Consider Bjorn, the Fell-Handed, the oldest living Dreadnought in Imperial service. He has served for over 10,000 years, since the time of the Great Crusade itself. He personally knew Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves. He fought in the Horus Heresy, and for most of those 10,000 years, he has been asleep, awakened only once per millennium, unless the chapter faces dire need. When he wakes, he finds that centuries have passed like moments. Brothers he fought beside are dust. The galaxy has changed beyond recognition, and yet he must fight on, because duty never ends. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Many Dreadnoughts gradually lose their grip on their former identity. The memories of life before interment fade like morning mist, replaced by an ever-growing catalogue of battles and tactical data. Some forget the faces of brothers they served with for decades. Others cannot remember their own names without consulting their chassis' databanks. The human elements slowly erode, worn away by the constant cycle of war, sleep, and awakening, until what remains is less a person and more a weapon that happens to retain the ghost of consciousness. And this erosion is not viewed as a tragedy by the Imperium. It is expected. It is, in some ways, desired. A Dreadnought that becomes more machine than man is easier to deploy, requires less moral consideration, causes fewer complications. The chaplains speak of it as the pilot's human weaknesses being burned away, leaving only pure dedication to the Emperor's service. The tech priests see it as a successful integration of flesh and machine. Only the Dreadnoughts themselves know the truth, that they are slowly dying by degrees, their souls leaching away into the darkness of endless sleep until nothing remains but the shell of what they once were. Now imagine such a warrior, entombed for not decades or centuries, but 2 full millennia, 2,000 years of darkness, 2,000 years of that half-death that is stasis sleep, 2,000 years in which the galaxy continued to turn, empires rose and fell, and the Imperium ground on in its eternal war against chaos and Xenos. 2,000 years of being forgotten, abandoned, lost to the void, or buried beneath the ruins of defeats long since recorded in dusty archives if they were recorded at all. What happens to a consciousness subjected to such an extended absence? Does it fracture completely, splintering into madness? Does it simply fade away, leaving an empty shell that might still respond to ancient programming, but contains nothing that could be called a soul? Or does something of the original warrior remain, clinging desperately to fragments of memory and identity like a drowning man clinging to wreckage? There is no good answer. There is only the certainty that whatever wakes after 2,000 years of sleep will not be the same being that was interred. The sleep of ages, 2 millennia in the dark, 2,000 years. For mortal humans, it is an expanse of time that defies comprehension. It is enough time for entire civilizations to rise from barbarism to galactic power and fall back into darkness. It is enough time for languages to evolve into mutually unintelligible dialects, for religions to transform beyond recognition, for technological advances that would seem like miracles, for a space marine dreadnought trapped in stasis sleep. It is an eternity compressed into a single moment of darkness. The stasis technology employed by the Adeptus Mechanicus is not true time stop. It is not the sort of suspended animation that preserves a being perfectly, frozen at a single instant. Instead, it is a slowing of biological processes to an infinitesimal crawl. Neurons still fire, but at a rate thousands or millions of times slower than normal. Consciousness still exists, but exists in a state so divorced from normal experience that it becomes something else entirely. Some tech priests theorize that time perception within stasis is completely absent, that the subject experiences awakening as instantaneous, no matter how long they have been dormant. Others suggest that some degraded form of awareness persists, creating a subjective experience of the passage of time that can drive even transhuman minds to madness. The truth, as is so often the case in Warhammer 40,000, is likely worse than either theory suggests. Based on accounts from dreadnoughts who have endured extended periods of stasis, the experience seems to vary wildly. Some report total blackness, a void in their memory between the moment of entering stasis and the moment of awakening, with no sense of time having passed at all. These are perhaps the lucky ones. Others describe dreams that loop endlessly, becoming more distorted and nightmarish with each repetition. Battle memories that replay over and over, gradually transforming into surreal horrors, where familiar faces melt into demon masks and the laws of reality bend and break. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from a dreadnought of the Lamenters chapter, who upon awakening after 400 years in stasis, reported that he had experienced every single second of those 4 centuries. He claimed he had been aware but paralyzed, trapped in absolute darkness with only his thoughts for company, unable to sleep or dream or do anything but exist in the void. When asked how he had retained his sanity, he replied simply that he had not. The chapter's chaplains declared his account a result of stasis disorientation and ordered him never to speak of it again. But the question remains: how many other dreadnoughts have endured similar experiences and simply lack the ability or will to communicate what they have suffered? Now extend this horror across 2,000 years. 2 full millennia of potential conscious suffering, or unconscious, drifting through nightmare realms, or simple non-existence that obliterates any sense of continuity of self. The dreadnought that enters stasis might as well be dying, because the thing that wakes will be fundamentally different, shaped by an experience that no living being was meant to endure. And there are practical considerations as well. 2,000 years is enough time for the technology itself to degrade. Stasis fields can develop micro-fluctuations. Life support systems can accumulate quantum errors that propagate through biological tissue. The sarcophagus itself, despite being built to last millennia, can develop stress fractures, coolant leaks, power fluctuations. Any of these could compromise the pilot's preservation, leading to brain damage, organ failure, or worse. Some dreadnoughts have awakened after extended stasis, to find that portions of their organic components have necrotized, requiring emergency surgical intervention by horrified tech marines. Others have awakened with gaps in their memory, personality changes, or cognitive deficits that render them barely functional. The psychological impact is compounded by what the Dreadnought finds upon awakening. If they have been lost for 2,000 years, they wake to a galaxy that has moved on without them. Their chapter may no longer exist, destroyed in some campaign, or declared excommunicate traitoris. Their brothers are long dead, not even dust anymore, but less than memory. The causes they fought for may have been forgotten or perverted into something unrecognizable. The Imperium they served may have changed so drastically that they no longer understand their place within it. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. You fall asleep believing you will wake in days or weeks to rejoin your brothers in battle. You wake to find that those brothers have been dead for longer than your chapter had existed when you were first interred. You wake to find that the war you were fighting ended in either victory or defeat so long ago that even the administratum has lost the records. You wake to find that you are a relic, an artifact, a curiosity from an age that no longer has any meaning. And yet, despite all of this, despite the horror and confusion and existential dread, a Space Marine Dreadnought is still a Space Marine. Duty remains. The oath sworn to the Emperor endures. The training that was psycho-conditioned into their minds from the moment they became scouts still functions. Even if their personality has fragmented, even if their memories have faded to almost nothing, the core programming remains. Fight, kill, serve, endure. It is both their curse and their salvation. This is the being that lies waiting in the darkness. This is what the Orks are about to discover. A warrior who has endured an eternity of suffering, who has been shaped by that suffering into something that is barely human anymore, who retains only the most basic imperatives of their former existence. And those imperatives all center on one thing: destroying the enemies of the Imperium. The Orks have no idea what they're about to unleash, but they're about to find out. The nature of Orks, brutality, cunning, and the WAH! To understand how Orks would react to discovering an ancient Dreadnought, you need to understand what Orks are at their core. They are not simply violent barbarians, though violence is certainly their preferred mode of interaction with the universe. They are not mindless beasts, despite what their crude appearance and brutal culture might suggest. Orks are a weaponized species, genetically engineered millions of years ago by the mysterious Old Ones during the War in Heaven, designed to be the perfect soldiers. And that design has endured, creating a race that exists purely for war and excels at it beyond almost any other species in the galaxy. Ork biology is fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. They are fungoid organisms, reproducing through spores that are released constantly throughout their lives and especially upon death. This means that any world touched by Orks becomes permanently infested, the spores growing into squigs and Gretchen before eventually producing full-sized Orks. They are extraordinarily tough, capable of surviving wounds that would kill even a space marine, their bodies able to regenerate from damage that would be fatal to any other species. They grow larger and stronger the more they fight, with the biggest and toughest Orks naturally rising to leadership positions through a simple hierarchy of violence. Might makes right. But the most remarkable and terrifying aspect of Ork biology is their Gestalt psychic field, commonly referred to as the WAG energy. All Orks generate this field unconsciously, and it grows stronger as more Orks gather in one place. This psychic field serves multiple functions. It allows Orks to instinctively recognize who is biggest and therefore in charge. It enables their ramshackle technology to function far beyond what should be physically possible, and it warps reality itself in subtle ways, making Ork beliefs into truth. The WAG field is the reason Ork technology works at all. To outside observers, Ork weapons and vehicles appear to be little more than scrap metal held together with welding and wishful thinking. And in the hands of a human or Eldar, they would be exactly that, non-functional junk. But when an Ork uses them, they work, because the Ork believes they will work. and the WH40 field makes that belief real. Orks believe that red vehicles go faster, so they do. They believe that yellow explosives make bigger booms, so they do. They believe that enough Daka solves any problem, and within the reality warping influence of the WH40, they're absolutely right. This extends to their scavenging and looting behavior. Orks are perhaps the most accomplished scavengers in the galaxy, with entire clans like the Death Skulls dedicated to the art of liberating equipment from other races. They have an instinctive understanding of how to take enemy technology and repurpose it for Orky use. A mech boy, the Ork engineer caste, can look at an Imperial Lehman Russ battle tank and immediately understand how to strip it down, rebuild it with Ork modifications, and get it running again, often during the same battle where it was captured. This scavenging instinct goes beyond simple pragmatism. Orks genuinely enjoy looting. They take immense pleasure in using captured equipment against its former owners. There's a particular Orky satisfaction in blowing up Humies with their own guns or running over Xenos in their own tanks. The more impressive the captured technology, the more status the Ork who looted it gains within the warband. And there's nothing more impressive than looting something truly ancient or powerful. The Ork philosophy toward combat is straightforward. More is better. More guns, more boys, more explosions, more noise, more violence. They call it Daka, and the Ork saying goes that there is no such thing as enough Daka. This drives them to constantly seek out bigger and better weapons, to create ever more destructive war machines, and to throw themselves into combat with reckless abandon that would be suicidal for any other race, but which Orks consider to be a grand day out. Different Ork clans express this philosophy in different ways. The Goths are brutally straightforward, preferring close combat and overwhelming numbers. The Evil Sons are obsessed with speed, believing that red makes their vehicles go faster and proving it through the power of the WH40 field. The Bad Moons are wealthy, their teeth growing faster than other Orks, and therefore giving them more currency to spend on flashy weapons and equipment. The Blood Axes are sneaky, willing to use tactics and strategy in ways that other Orks consider un-Orky. And the Death Skulls are the looters par excellence, their blue war paint believed to bring good luck, especially when it comes to scavenging. Orks also have a strange relationship with scale and size. They respect bigness. The bigger something is, the more impressed they are by it. This is why they build gargants, massive walking war machines that tower over battlefields. This is why the biggest Ork automatically becomes the war boss. And this is why, when Orks encounter something truly massive and impressive, their first instinct is a mixture of appreciation, excitement, and an overwhelming desire to either fight it or loot it, preferably both. Their intelligence should not be underestimated. While individual Ork boys might seem like simple thugs, interested only in the next fight, Orks as a species display remarkable problem-solving abilities, particularly when it comes to warfare and technology. Mech boys have an instinctive understanding of mechanics that allows them to create weapons and vehicles that shouldn't function but do. Pain boys understand surgery and biology well enough to graft cybernetics onto Orks, turning them into hulking cyborgs. Weird boys can channel the WH40 energy into devastating psychic attacks. And when Orks gather in sufficient numbers, when a WH40 truly gets going, they become something more than a mob of savage warriors. They become an unstoppable tide, a force of nature that can overwhelm entire sectors through sheer numbers, ferocity, and the reality-warping power of their collective psychic field. The greatest WHs in Imperial history have threatened the very existence of the Imperium, requiring the deployment of entire Space Marine chapters and Imperial Guard crusades to stop. This is the nature of the beings who are about to discover a 2,000-year-old Dreadnought. They are violent, yes, crude, certainly, but they are also cunning in their own way, relentless in their pursuit of a good fight, and possessed of both the technology and the psychic power to make even the most unlikely scenarios possible. When they find something as impressive and valuable as an ancient dreadnought, they won't simply ignore it or destroy it out of hand. They will want to understand it, to loot it, to make it theirs. And in trying to do so, they will trigger events that neither they nor the dreadnought could predict. How a dreadnought gets lost. For 2,000 years, the galaxy is vast beyond comprehension, and war has been constant for millennia. In such an environment, it is not only possible but inevitable that warriors and their equipment will be lost, abandoned, forgotten. For a dreadnought to remain dormant for 2,000 years requires a specific set of circumstances, but those circumstances are far from rare in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The most common scenario involves space hulks, these massive conglomerations of wrecked ships, fused together by the chaotic energies of the warp and drifting through real space and the Imperium alike, are tomb ships of galactic scale. Space hulks form when vessels become lost in warp storms, when fleets are destroyed in battle, and the wreckage is caught in warp currents, when ancient ships, from the dark age of technology, drift for millennia before colliding with more recent derelicts. The result is a nightmare amalgamation of vessels from different eras, different factions, all crushed and melded together into a single massive structure. Space hulks are incredibly dangerous to explore. Their interiors are a maze of twisted corridors, collapsed chambers, and spaces that no longer obey normal physical laws due to warp exposure. They are infested with all manner of horrors, genestealers that use the hulks to travel between star systems, chaos cultists hiding from imperial justice, demons that slip through the thin barriers between reality and the warp, and yes, orcs, who use space hulks as their primary method of interstellar travel. A dreadnought could easily end up aboard a space hulk. Perhaps the hulk contains the wreckage of a space marine strike cruiser, destroyed in battle and lost to the warp. The dreadnought, secured in the deep halls of the vessel, would have entered stasis before the ship's destruction. When the ship was caught in the warp, and eventually merged with other derelicts to form a hulk, the dreadnought remained in its chamber, surrounded by the twisted metal of the destroyed cruiser, isolated and forgotten. The stasis field would continue to function, powered by the remnant energy in the sarcophagus's own power cells, or by some quirk of the warp energies that suffuse the hulk. Over centuries and millennia, the space hulk would drift through the warp, occasionally erupting back into real space, for periods ranging from days to years, before being dragged back into the Imperium. Each time it materialized, there would be a chance for someone to explore it, to find the dreadnought. But space hulks are vast, often measuring dozens of kilometers across, and containing the remnants of hundreds of individual ships. The odds of any explorer finding one specific chamber in such a labyrinth are astronomically small, until eventually the Orks arrive. Orks love space hulks. They use them as transport, as bases, as sources of scrap and loot. When a space hulk emerges from the warp near an Ork-held system, or when a warband of freebooters encounters one drifting through space, they swarm aboard with all the enthusiasm of children discovering a playground. And unlike more cautious explorers who might carefully map the hulk's interior and proceed with appropriate caution, Orks simply charge in, kicking down doors and bashing through walls, exploring through the expedient method of breaking everything they find until they discover something interesting. Another scenario involves lost worlds. The Imperium spans millions of worlds, and many of them have been lost to war, plague, warp storms, or simple administrative error. A chapter might deploy to a world to defend it against invasion, only to be overwhelmed and destroyed. If the world itself is then lost to warp storms or abandoned by the Imperium, any dreadnoughts left behind would remain in their fortress monastery or deployment zone, their stasis systems keeping them dormant while the world around them crumbles. Consider a fortress monastery on a world that falls to chaos. The Space Marines fight to the last, but in the end, they are overwhelmed. The fortress is destroyed, its walls cast down, its halls filled with rubble. But deep in the lower levels, protected by meters of rockcrete and ceramite, a dreadnought remains in stasis. The Chaos forces loot what they can and move on, never finding the hidden chamber. The world becomes a demon world, twisted by the warp. Centuries pass. The fortress becomes completely buried under ash and volcanic rock from the planet's transformed geography. 2,000 years later, the planet is reclaimed by the Imperium, or simply drifts back toward real space as the warp storm moves on. Orks arrive, drawn by the possibility of a good scrap with whatever Chaos forces remain, or simply attracted by the faint psychic signature of all the violence that soaked into the world. As they dig through ruins looking for salvage, one particularly enterprising group of looters breaks into an underground chamber that hasn't been opened in 2 millennia, and there, in the darkness, they find the Dreadnought. A third possibility involves the aftermath of catastrophic battles. The Imperium has fought millions of wars across its history, and not all battlefields are thoroughly searched afterward. Sometimes a battle is so costly that the Imperial forces retreat immediately, unable to recover their dead or salvage their equipment. Sometimes a world is simply too damaged to make recovery efforts worthwhile, and sometimes the bureaucratic nightmare of the administratum simply loses track of who was where and when, leaving equipment abandoned on worlds whose very existence has been forgotten. A dreadnought could be lost during such a battle. Perhaps it was buried under a collapsing building. Perhaps it was caught in a warp anomaly that placed it in temporal stasis while the battle raged around it. Perhaps its chassis was so damaged that it appeared to be destroyed, and it was left behind when the chapter withdrew, its stasis system keeping the pilot alive, but unable to signal for recovery. Whatever the specific circumstances, the result is the same. A dreadnought, lost and forgotten, waiting in darkness while the centuries accumulate. The final consideration is the warp itself. The warp does not play by the rules of normal space-time. Objects caught in warp storms can experience time dilation effects that make mockery of causality. A ship might be lost in the warp for what seems like weeks to the crew, only to emerge into real space to find that thousands of years have passed. Conversely, a vessel might spend millennia in the warp and emerge mere hours after it disappeared from objective reality. A dreadnought caught in such a situation would experience subjective time normally if it were awake. But in stasis, it would have no awareness of time passing at all. From the pilot's perspective, they might enter stasis believing they will wake in a few hours or days, only to find upon awakening that they have been lost for 2,000 years due to warp time effects. The horror of such a discovery would be profound, but no more so than the horror they have already endured simply by existing as a dreadnought. In any of these scenarios, the result is the same. A warrior out of time, a relic from an age long past, waiting in the darkness for someone or something to find them. And when the Orks arrive, driven by their insatiable hunger for loot and violence, that waiting ends. The discovery. When Orks find the sleeper. Picture the scene. A mob of Orks moving through the twisted corridors of a space hulk, or picking through the ruins of an ancient fortress, or excavating what they believe to be a particularly promising pile of scrap. They're not being quiet about it. Orks are never quiet. There's shouting in their guttural language, the clang of tools against metal, the occasional explosion as someone gets overly enthusiastic with demo charges, and the constant background noise of Orks arguing about who saw what first and who has the right to loot it. The group is likely a mix of types. Some ordinary boys, green-skinned and brutal, armed with choppers and shooters. A few looters, specialist Orks who carry the heaviest weapons they can scavenge. Their gear a chaotic assemblage of Imperial, Tau, and Elder components crudely welded together into shoulder-mounted gun platforms. Perhaps a mech boy or two, their heads full of instinctive mechanical knowledge, already examining the walls and floors for anything that looks valuable or interesting. And leading them, A knob, bigger and meaner than the rest, making sure the boys stay focused on looting rather than fighting each other. They're deep in whatever structure they're exploring now, far from any obvious paths or frequently traveled routes. Maybe they're following a power reading that one of the mechs detected. Maybe they're just wandering, operating on the Ork principle, that if you look hard enough in any pile of junk, you'll eventually find something good. The air is thick with dust, or the recycled atmosphere of a space hulk. Glow rods provide sporadic illumination, casting jumping shadows on walls that might be bulkheads, or might be stone, or might be something else entirely. And then they find it. The chamber is different from the others they've passed through. The walls are thicker, reinforced with layers of ceramite and adamantium. The door, if there was ever a door, has been replaced by a solid wall of rockcrete, or has been sealed by emergency bulkheads, or has simply been buried under 2,000 years of accumulated debris. The Orks don't care. Walls are meant to be broken through. The knob yells orders. The mechs start placing charges or firing up cutting torches, and with a combination of brute force and crude but effective demolition techniques, they breach the wall. The chamber beyond is dark. Not the darkness of a space hulk corridor with failing lights, but the absolute darkness of a sealed chamber that hasn't been opened in millennia. The Orks push forward, glow rods held high, and the light catches something. At first, they might not even recognize what they're seeing. It's big, that much is obvious. Orks appreciate bigness, and this is properly massive, easily 3 or 4 times the height of even the biggest knob. It's made of metal, which is good because metal means loot. There are weapons visible, huge guns and claws that look properly killy. The whole thing is covered in a fine layer of dust or frost, giving it a ghostly appearance in the dim light of the Orks' glow rods. The chamber itself tells a story, though the Orks are too focused on the prize before them to read it. The walls bear scorch marks from ancient battles, patterns of damage that suggest the chamber was once part of a larger fortification or ship. There are the remains of other equipment scattered around. Broken weapons racks, crushed storage containers, the skeletal remains of what might have been servitors or even space marines, though 2,000 years of decay have reduced them to little more than bone fragments and rust. The air, when the Orks finally break through completely, rushes out in a whoosh that sounds almost like a sigh, as if the chamber itself has been holding its breath for all these centuries. The temperature inside is significantly colder than the surrounding environment, the result of whatever stasis systems have been keeping the Dreadnought preserved. Condensation forms immediately on the Orks' equipment as the warm air from outside meets the cold air within, creating a brief fog that adds to the eerie atmosphere. One of the younger Orks, a youth who hasn't seen many proper scraps yet, is seized by a sudden and uncharacteristic sense of unease. There's something about this place, something about the massive metal figure standing silent in the darkness, that triggers primitive survival instincts buried deep beneath the Orks' enthusiasm for violence. He opens his mouth to suggest they leave it alone, maybe find something else to loot, but before he can speak, an older knob cuffs him hard enough to rattle his teeth. As more light floods the chamber, details become visible. The shape is roughly humanoid, a massive armored torso supported by thick legs, with arms that end in weapons. There are markings on the armor, symbols and heraldry that mean nothing to most Orks, but which make the mechs pause and look more closely. There are purity seals, long since decayed into brittle fragments. There are layers of damage, scorch marks from ancient battles, dents and tears in the armor, signs of repairs made long ago by skilled tech marines. And at the center of the torso, embedded in the thickest armor, there's a sarcophagus. The Orks don't know what it is, not at first. It looks like a heavily armored box, covered in more symbols and mechanisms. Some of the Orks might think it's just extra armor, but the mechs, their instinctive understanding of machinery, giving them insight that the boys lack, recognize it for what it is, a container, a very well-protected container. And inside that container, something is being kept alive. The initial Ork response is excitement mixed with confusion. They found something big and impressive, which is always good. but they're not entirely sure what it is. Some of the younger boys might think it's just a big suit of armor, waiting to be looted and worn. The more experienced Orks, especially those who have fought against Space Marines before, recognize it as something related to the Humies warriors. The mechs are immediately fascinated by the technical challenge it represents. There's a lot of shouting. Orks communicate through volume, and everyone has an opinion about what they've found and what should be done with it. Some want to immediately start smashing it apart to see what makes it work. Others want to try to get it running, imagining the glory of using such an impressive war machine. The Nob has to assert authority, which he does through the traditional Ork method of kicking the loudest dissenters in the head until they shut up. The mechs move in closer, running their hands over the armor, examining the weapon mounts, tracing power cables and hydraulic systems. Their genetically encoded knowledge is giving them flashes of insight. This is old tech, good tech, stuff that even Humies don't make anymore. The power plant is dormant, but not dead. The weapons are still connected to ammunition feeds, though who knows if there's any ammo left after all this time. And there's something else, something the mechs can't quite identify, but which makes them uneasy. A very faint energy reading, barely detectable, coming from the sarcophagus. One of the looters, less patient than the mechs, decides to get a better look at the weapons. He climbs up onto the Dreadnought's arm, using the armor plating as handholds. His weight causes a subtle shift in the chassis, the first movement it's made in 2,000 years. Ancient servos protest with a grinding sound that makes all the Orks freeze. And deep within the sarcophagus, buried beneath layers of armor and shielding, something stirs. The Dreadnought's power core, kept at minimal activity by the stasis field, registers the external vibrations. Ancient safety protocols, older than the Imperium itself, activate. The system begins diagnostic routines, checking power levels, testing connections, preparing for potential reactivation. The process is slow, glacial even, operating at the pace dictated by power cells that have been dormant for millennia. But it has begun. The Orks don't notice, not yet. They're too busy arguing about whether to smash the big metal Humie or try to make it work. The Nob is leaning toward the latter option, because if they could get something this impressive operational, the glory would be immense. The war boss would definitely hear about it. There might be a promotion involved. At the very least, there would be a proper scrap once they got the thing working. The mechs are already discussing how to access the power systems. Ork technical knowledge is instinctive rather than learned, and what they're looking at is triggering all sorts of interesting ideas. They can see where power cables connect, where the main reactor should be, where the weapon systems draw energy. It's different from Ork tech, cleaner and more precise, but the basic principles are the same. Power goes in, violence comes out. One of Baum, the mechs produces a rather large wrench and approaches what he's identified as an access panel. He's going to get this thing open and take a proper look at the insides. Maybe they can get it powered up. Maybe they can strip out the good bits and use them for other projects. Either way, it's going to be a proper laugh. As he positions the wrench against the panel's locking mechanism, ready to apply Ork problem-solving techniques, which primarily involve hitting things very hard, the Dreadnought systems reach a critical threshold. The diagnostic routines detect external tampering. Threat assessment protocols activate. And after 2,000 years of darkness, after an eternity of sleep that should have lasted forever, the awakening sequence begins. Deep in the sarcophagus, buried in chemical baths and wrapped in cables, what remains of the Space Marine pilot begins the long journey back to consciousness. The awakening. Consciousness returns. For 2,000 years, there has been nothing. No dreams, no thoughts, no sense of self. Only the void, vast and empty and eternal. And then, like dawn breaking over a world that has known only night, awareness begins to return. It starts with sensation, though sensation is perhaps the wrong word for what a Dreadnought experiences. There is no skin to feel temperature, no muscles to register tension. Instead, there are data streams, information feeds from thousands of sensors built into the chassis, temperature readings from external armor plating, pressure sensors in the feet registering contact with the ground, or in this case, contact with nothing because the Dreadnought is in its stationary configuration. Power flow indicators showing minimal energy throughout the system. The first conscious thought, if it can be called thought, is simple confusion. There should be something. Context, memory of what came before. But there's only emptiness. The pilot's organic brain, kept alive in the sarcophagus through chemical and mechanical means, has been offline for so long that the neural pathways necessary for complex cognition have temporarily degraded. They will rebuild, given time and stimulation. But right now, there is only the most basic awareness. I exist. I think. Therefore, I am. The diagnostic routines continue automatically, below the threshold of consciousness. Checking weapons systems status. All weapons offline. Ammunition magazines showing full or near full capacity. Checking motor functions. All servos locked in standby configuration. Checking power reserves. Critically low, running on emergency backup cells. Checking life support. All functions nominal. Chemical feeds balanced. Pilot vitals stable within acceptable parameters for extended stasis. And then, as higher brain functions slowly reactivate, the questions begin. Where am I? When am I? Who am I? That last question is the most troubling. There should be a name. There should be memories, a sense of identity and history. There should be knowledge of what chapter they serve, what campaigns they fought, who their battle brothers were. But all of that is buried under 2,000 years of darkness, hidden behind walls of degraded neural tissue and fragmented memory engrams. The pilot knows they are space marine. The psycho-conditioning runs deep enough to survive even this extended dormancy. But beyond that, nothing. Only shadows and fragments. External stimuli begin to filter through the sensory systems. The Dreadnought's optical sensors have been offline, conserving power, but other sensors are active. Audio receptors pick up sounds, voices, loud and rough, speaking a language that the pilot's auto-translate systems struggle to process. Movement sensors detect vibrations in the chassis, someone or something climbing on the exterior armor. Atmospheric sensors register air quality, temperature, the presence of various chemical compounds. The threat assessment routines, running independently of conscious thought, categorize these stimuli as potential hostile contact. The weapon systems begin their own startup sequence, though without main power they can't fully activate. The pilot, consciousness still fragmentary and confused, receives the information in a jumbled rush of data that makes no coherent sense. Meanwhile, outside the sarcophagus, the Orks have noticed changes. The Dreadnought, which had been completely inert moments before, is now producing sounds. Soft mechanical whirs as ancient gears begin to turn, the click of relays activating, a faint hum as capacitors slowly charge, and from somewhere deep within the chassis, a sound that makes even the bravest Ork pause, a rhythmic thumping, slow and steady, like a heartbeat amplified 100 times. One of the younger boys, his survival instincts not yet completely beaten down by Ork culture, suggests that maybe they should step back a bit. The knob hits him for being a coward, but even the knob is watching the Dreadnought more carefully now. Something is happening. Something is waking up. Inside the sarcophagus, consciousness is spreading through the pilot's brain like water soaking into dry earth. Memories are surfacing, though they're fragmented and nonsensical. A battle, somewhere. The names of brothers, though the faces are gone. The feeling of power armor, the reassuring weight of a bolter in hands that no longer exist. And pain. The pain of catastrophic injury, the kind of pain that transcends description, the moment when the body breaks beyond any hope of repair. The pilot remembers dying, remembers falling on some battlefield whose name is lost, remembers the apothecaries working frantically, their medical equipment unable to stabilize the massive trauma, remembers the choice that wasn't a choice, die with honor, or serve the Emperor forever in a shell of ceramite and steel. They chose duty. They always choose duty. And then there was darkness. The diagnostic systems report that main power is available if reactivation is authorized. The pilot, consciousness still fragmented but growing more coherent by the second, authorizes reactivation on pure instinct. This is what they do. This is what they are. A warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, and warriors fight. The Dreadnought's reactor, a miniaturized nuclear fusion plant that has been offline for 2 millennia, receives the activation command. Emergency startup procedures begin. Coolant systems pump long-dormant fluids through distribution networks, clearing blockages and checking for leaks. Fuel cells that have slowly decayed over centuries are bypassed, fresh fuel drawn from reserves. And then, with a sound like thunder contained in metal, the reactor ignites. The Orks, who had been gathered around the Dreadnought in a loose semicircle, jump back as the machine suddenly roars to life. Lights activate across the chassis, burning bright after their long sleep. The armor plating shifts as servos unlock and power surges through the frame. The weapon systems come online with a series of metallic clanks as safeties disengage and ammunition feeds connect. And the eyes, the optical sensors set into the Dreadnought's head unit, blaze to life with a fierce red glow that cuts through the darkness of the chamber like searchlights. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot is overwhelmed by sensation. The machine is alive again, and that means they are alive again, for all practical purposes. The Dreadnought's body is their body now. They can feel it in a way that doesn't quite map to organic sensation, but which is nonetheless real. They feel the strength in the chassis' limbs, the weight of the weapons, the massive armor that makes them effectively invulnerable to all but the heaviest fire. But they also feel wrong, disoriented, confused. The last clear memory is of a battle, but they don't know which battle or when it was. They remember brothers fighting alongside them, but the names and faces are gone. They remember their chapter's colors, its heraldry, its battle cries, but contextualizing that information into a coherent narrative is beyond their current capability. The only thing that is absolutely clear, burned into their consciousness at a level deeper than memory or identity, is the mission: destroy the enemies of the Emperor. And as the Dreadnought's optical sensors focus on the figures gathered around them in the chamber, as the threat recognition software identifies them with crystal clarity, that mission becomes very simple indeed. They are Orks, Xenos, the ancient enemy, and they must be purged. The Dreadnought begins to move. First blood. The ancient warrior awakens to violence. The Orks have perhaps 3 seconds to process what's happening before all hell breaks loose. 3 seconds in which the Dreadnought's massive frame shifts from complete stillness to explosive motion. 3 seconds in which ancient servos, not fully warmed up and operating at reduced efficiency after millennia of dormancy, nonetheless propel several tons of adamantium and ceramite forward with shocking speed. The Nob, to his credit, reacts quickly. He bellows a warning and tries to bring his power claw up into a defensive position. It doesn't help. The Dreadnought's power fist, a massive weapon capable of crushing battle tanks, descends in a brutal overhand strike that catches the Nob square in the chest. There's a sickening crunch, a spray of blood and metal fragments as the Nob's armor crumples like paper, and the Ork is driven into the ground with such force that the floor cracks beneath the impact. The other Orks scatter, survival instinct overriding their natural belligerence. But the chamber is only so large, and the Dreadnought is blocking the only exit. They're trapped in here with an ancient war machine that has just woken up after 2,000 years of darkness, and it's clear that it's not happy about having been disturbed. The Dreadnought's assault cannon spins up with a high-pitched whine that rises into a mechanical scream. Centuries of ammunition preservation techniques have kept the shells viable, and when the weapon fires, it does so with devastating effect. The stream of mass-reactive rounds tears through the chamber like a buzzsaw, each shell exploding on impact. Orks are shredded, their bodies torn apart by the concentrated fire. Blood and gore paint the walls in great splashing arcs. Some of the orcs try to fight back. The looters bring their scavenged heavy weapons to bear, firing wildly in the Dreadnought's direction. The Dreadnought's armor, while ancient, is still adamantium and ceramite plating, designed to withstand the heaviest weapons of the Imperium's arsenals. Orc bullets spark harmlessly off the surface, doing no damage whatsoever. A rocket manages to find its mark, exploding against the Dreadnought's torso in a blossom of fire and smoke. When the smoke clears, there's a scorch mark on the armor, nothing more. The Dreadnought advances, each step a thunderous impact that shakes the floor. One of the mechs, braver or more foolish than his companions, charges forward with a massive wrench held in both hands. He's trying to get to the Dreadnought's legs, presumably planning to sabotage the joints and bring the war machine down. The Dreadnought doesn't even pause. A backhanded sweep of the power fist catches the mech mid-charge and sends him flying across the chamber to impact the wall with a wet crunch. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot is experiencing combat for the first time in 2,000 years, and it's the only thing that makes sense in a universe that has become incomprehensible. This is familiar. This is comfortable. The HUD display shows enemy positions, highlighted in red. The targeting systems provide firing solutions automatically. The weapons respond to thought as if they were extensions of the pilot's own body, because in a very real sense, they are. The sensory experience of combat as a Dreadnought is unlike anything a flesh and blood warrior experiences. There's no adrenaline rush, no racing heartbeat, no quickening of breath. Instead, there are data streams flooding the consciousness with information. Temperature gradients showing where weapons are heating up, structural integrity readings measuring damage to armor plating, ammunition counters ticking down with each burst of fire, power distribution graphs showing energy flow through the chassis systems. The pilot processes all of this instantaneously, the transhuman brain enhanced by centuries of experience and psycho-conditioning, making tactical decisions faster than most humans can perceive threats. Target priority is automatic. The biggest orcs first. They're the most dangerous. The knobs who are commanding their boys get priority targeting. The looters with heavy weapons are secondary threats. The regular boys are numerous but individually weak, dealt with through area effect weapons rather than precision targeting. But beneath the cold tactical analysis, there's something else stirring. A fragment of the person who used to be, buried deep beneath layers of mechanical interface and psycho-conditioning. That fragment recognizes the orcs not just as targets, but as the ancient enemy, the Xenos threat that has plagued humanity since before the Imperium existed. There's something almost like hatred there, though whether it's the pilot's genuine emotion or simply programmed response is impossible to say. Perhaps there's no difference anymore. Perhaps hatred and duty have merged into a single unified purpose. But there's something off about the experience. The pilot's tactical assessment systems, burned into their brain through years of training and psycho-conditioning, are telling them that something is wrong. The enemies are not displaying appropriate combat behavior for orcs. They're panicking, which orcs don't do. They're not coordinating their attack. They're just firing randomly and trying to escape. And most tellingly, there are no enemy reinforcements arriving, no supporting elements, no heavy weapons teams or vehicle support. These thoughts filter through the pilot's consciousness slowly, delayed by the mental fog that still clouds their thinking. Understanding comes in fragments. This isn't a planned battle. This is a chance encounter. The orcs weren't expecting combat. They were just scavenging, and they found something they didn't understand, and now they're paying the price for their curiosity. For a brief moment, something that might be pity flickers through the pilot's mind. These orcs were just looters. They weren't even warriors, not really. Just scavengers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then the moment passes, and only duty remains. They are orcs. They are Xenos. And Xenos must be purged, no matter the circumstances. The heavy flamer mounts beneath the assault cannon. It activates with a whoosh of igniting promethium, bathing the remaining orcs in liquid fire. Their screams are brief. cut short as the flames consume them. The intense heat causes their ammunition to cook off, adding secondary explosions to the carnage. Within seconds, every orc in the chamber is dead or dying, their bodies reduced to charred meat and melted metal. The Dreadnought stands amid the destruction, weapons still active, scanning for additional targets. The chamber is silent, except for the crackling of flames and the occasional pop of exploding ammunition. The pilot's consciousness is becoming more focused, the fog of stasis sleep gradually lifting as their brain reacclimates to wakefulness. Questions begin to form. Where is this? When is this? How long was the sleep? The data feeds from the Dreadnought's chronometer are showing dates that don't make sense. Numbers that suggest an impossible passage of time. 2,000 years. It's been 2,000 years. The pilot's mind rejects this information at first, the sheer scale of it too vast to comprehend. But the data is clear, verified by multiple redundant systems. 2,000 years. Everyone they knew is dead. Their chapter might not even exist anymore. The galaxy has moved on, and they have been left behind, a relic from an age long past. The existential horror of this realization threatens to overwhelm their consciousness, but transhuman conditioning kicks in, compartmentalizing the emotional trauma and allowing them to focus on immediate tactical concerns. They are in an unknown location, possibly hostile territory. They have just engaged and eliminated a group of orc scavengers, which means there are likely more orcs nearby. Their power reserves are still low, running on the main reactor but not fully charged. Ammunition is depleted by approximately 8% from the brief engagement. There is no communication with friendly forces, no Imperial signals detected on any frequency. They are alone. The thought should be terrifying. For most humans, even most space marines, such complete isolation would be crushing. But Dreadnoughts are used to isolation. They spend decades or centuries between awakenings, alone in the darkness of stasis sleep. This is just another form of the same thing, alone, cut off, with only duty to sustain them. The pilot begins to move toward the chamber's exit, the damaged bulkhead where the orcs had broken through. As they approach, they can hear sounds from beyond, shouts in the orc language, the thunder of boots on metal decking, the unmistakable clamor of a warband mobilizing for combat. The orcs who escaped the initial slaughter must have raised the alarm. Reinforcements are coming. Good. The pilot's consciousness, still fragmented and incomplete, still struggling to make sense of existence after 2,000 years of absence, at least understands one thing with perfect clarity. There is an enemy nearby, and that enemy must be destroyed. The mission continues. Orc. Escalation. The Wah! Responds. The surviving orcs from the initial encounter didn't run very far before they met more of their mob. The wounded looters and regular boys, babbling incoherently about a massive metal humie that woke up and started killing everyone, find themselves face to face with a much larger group of orcs who had been exploring other sections of whatever structure they're in. The reaction is immediate and predictable. The orcs don't question whether the story is true. They don't doubt that their comrades just got their heads kicked in by some ancient war machine. They don't stop to consider tactical implications or strategic withdrawal. They hear that there's a proper scrap happening, and their immediate response is to grab their weapons and charge toward it, bellowing war cries and already arguing about who's going to get the best loot when they win. The war boss of this particular warband, a massive orc covered in scars and wearing armor looted from at least 3 different armies, hears the commotion and comes to investigate. When he's told about the metal humie, his reaction is not fear or caution, it's excitement. He's fought space marines before, killed plenty of the beaky gits, but he's never fought one of the really big ones, the ones that stomp around in the huge metal bodies. This is going to be a proper fight. This is going to be glorious. The war boss roars orders, and the mob begins to organize in the chaotic way that only orcs can manage. Boys are gathering, forming up into loose formations based on their clan affiliations, or simply on who they happen to be standing next to. Knobs, are bellowing at their subordinates, trying to maintain some semblance of control, while also positioning themselves at the front of the charge, because knobs don't lead from behind. They lead from the most killy position available. Mechs are being dragged forward, told to bring their biggest weapons. There's a Death Dread nearby, one of the Ork equivalents to a Space Marine Dreadnought, and its pilot is woken from his own miserable half-sleep and ordered to get ready for a scrap. Several killer cans, smaller walkers piloted by Gretchen, are hastily armed with whatever heavy weapons are available. And as more Orks gather, as the excitement of impending combat spreads through the warband, something else begins to happen. The wah! Energy starts to build. It's subtle at first, just a faint psychic pressure in the air, barely noticeable even to those rare humans with psychic sensitivity. But it's there, and it's growing stronger with every passing second, as more Orks focus their collective will on the same goal: killing the big metal Humie and taking its stuff. The gathering represents a cross-section of Ork society in all its brutal diversity. There are goth boys, dressed in black and adorned with crude checker patterns, eager to prove their worth in close combat. Evil Sun's speed freaks, painted in garish reds and yellows, revving their bikes and trucks, even though there's nowhere to drive in the confined spaces. Bad Moons, with their flash gits attitude, sporting gold-painted weapons and more teeth than they know what to do with. Blood Axes, who actually consider using something resembling tactics, much to the disgust of the other Orks who consider such behavior un-Orky. Among them move the specialist castes. Pain Boys, the Ork surgeons, their crude medical implements stained with the blood of 1,000 operations, already contemplating what interesting cybernetics they might scavenge from the metal Humie. Weird Boys, the psychic Orks, who can feel the wah energy more keenly than anyone, their eyes beginning to glow with sickly green light as power courses through them. Burner Boys with their flame weapons, eager to roast something big. Tank Busters with their armor-piercing rockets, specifically geared toward destroying heavy vehicles and walkers. The diversity of Ork forces represents both their strength and their weakness. They have specialists for every situation, weapons for every enemy, and tactics for every scenario, all cobbled together from instinct and stolen technology. But coordinating all these disparate elements is like herding especially violent and stupid cats. The only thing that keeps them focused is the promise of a really good fight. And right now that promise is being fulfilled. The effect of this growing wah field is immediate and tangible. Ork weapons that barely functioned moments ago suddenly seem more reliable. A mech who was struggling to get a rocket launcher operational finds the solution coming to him instinctively, his hands moving through repairs with uncharacteristic precision. The Death Dread servos, which had been grinding and seizing up, suddenly operate smoothly, as if freshly oiled. Even the Orks themselves seem bigger, meaner, more confident. This is the WAG at work. Not the massive galaxy-spanning crusades that can threaten entire sectors, but the smaller, more focused manifestation that occurs when Orks gather for combat. Reality itself is bending slightly, warping in response to the collective psychic pressure of hundreds of Orks, all thinking the same basic thought: we're going to win this fight. The first wave hits the Dreadnought less than 5 minutes after the initial engagement. They come pouring through corridors and hatches, a green tide of muscle and violence, shouting and shooting and swinging crude weapons with reckless abandon. They have no formation, no tactical coordination in the Imperial sense. But they have numbers, and they have momentum, and they have absolute confidence in their ability to overwhelm anything through sheer volume of violence. The Dreadnought meets them in what used to be a corridor, but which the Orks' entry has transformed into a kill zone. The assault cannon opens up again, the rotating barrels spewing shells into the oncoming mass of Xenos. Orks are torn apart, their bodies exploding under the impact of mass reactive rounds. The heavy flamer adds gouts of burning promethium to the slaughter, turning the corridor into an inferno. But the Orks keep coming. They charge over the bodies of their fallen comrades without hesitation, firing their shooters and rockets in the Dreadnought's general direction. Most of their shots miss completely. Some impact the walls and ceiling, causing structural damage that threatens to collapse the corridor. A few actually hit the Dreadnought, though they accomplish little beyond adding new scorch marks to the ancient armor. The Dreadnought advances into the mob, power fist swinging in wide arcs that send orcs flying like broken toys. Each impact kills at least one, and usually catches 2 or 3 more in the backswing. The weight of the Dreadnought's steps crushes orcs who fall in its path, reducing them to green paste on the decking. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot is experiencing something approaching clarity. Combat is familiar. Combat makes sense in a way that nothing else does. The enemies are clearly defined. The objective is simple. Kill everything that moves until nothing hostile remains. This is what Space Marines were made for. This is what Dreadnoughts do. But there's a problem. The Orks are not breaking. They should be breaking by now. Any sane enemy, faced with such overwhelming firepower and such impossible odds, would retreat, regroup, maybe try a different tactical approach. The Orks are just charging forward, taking catastrophic casualties and not seeming to care. It's like fighting a natural disaster, a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with or intimidated, only destroyed. And they just keep coming. The second wave brings heavier weapons. Ork looters with scavenged missile launchers and heavy bolters. Mechs with custom mega blasters that arc lightning across the battlefield. A deaf dread pushes through the mob of boys, its pilot screaming with battle madness, all 4 of its arms firing simultaneously. The corridor becomes a storm of bullets, rockets, flames, and psychotic violence. The Dreadnought's armor, while formidable, is beginning to show signs of strain. A rocket impacts the left shoulder joint, damaging the servo motors and reducing the power fist's operational efficiency. A sustained burst of heavy bolter fire manages to penetrate a weak point in the torso armor, causing minor damage to internal systems. Warning indicators light up on the pilot's HUD, showing structural integrity at 92% and declining. The pilot responds by increasing the tempo of violence. If the Orks want a brawl, they'll get one. The Dreadnought charges forward, using its mass as a weapon, simply trampling Orks beneath its feet. The Power Fist, despite its damaged servos, still has enough strength to punch through the Death Dread's armor when the 2 walkers collide in the center of the corridor. The Ork machine tries to wrestle with the Dreadnought, its crude strength surprising in its intensity. But Space Marine engineering is superior to Ork scrap tech. The Dreadnought tears the Death Dread apart, ripping its arms off and crushing its pilot chamber until the screaming inside stops. But even this victory is costly. The brief melee has allowed more Orks to close the distance, and now they're swarming over the Dreadnought's chassis, trying to find weak points, bashing at joints and sensors with their choppers and wrenches. It's like being attacked by particularly violent and determined insects, each individually harmless, but collectively capable of causing real damage. The Dreadnought activates its close defense systems. Automated flamers mounted in the chassis' extremities spray burning promethium in all directions, incinerating the Orks climbing on its armor. Their corpses fall away, trailing smoke, but more immediately take their places. And through it all, the WAG energy keeps building. The Orks are having the time of their lives. This is the best scrap they've had in ages. The big metal Hume is really putting up a fight, killing tons of boys and making lots of noise and explosions. It's everything an Ork could want from combat. And as their collective excitement grows, reality warps further to accommodate their beliefs. An Ork's shooter that was misfiring starts working perfectly. A rocket that should have flown wide instead impacts exactly where the Ork was aiming. The Orks themselves seem tougher, shrugging off wounds that should have killed them and fighting on with berserker fury. This is the War field at its most pronounced, Not a massive, overwhelming force, but a subtle, pervasive influence that tips the scales just enough to matter. The Dreadnought, despite its superior technology and the skill of its pilot, is beginning to show signs of real damage. Armor is cracked and torn in multiple places. Ammunition reserves are depleting rapidly. Power levels are dropping as the reactor strains to keep up with the demands being placed on it. The pilot's own organic body, kept alive in the sarcophagus through chemical feeds and life support, is experiencing stress responses as adrenaline analogs flood their system. This cannot continue indefinitely. Something has to give. Possible outcomes. When titans clash. The battle between a 2,000-year-old dreadnought and a warband of orcs can resolve in multiple ways, each dependent on specific circumstances and variables. Let's explore the most likely scenarios and their implications. The first and perhaps most dramatic outcome is mutual destruction. The dreadnought, running low on ammunition and power, makes a final stand. The pilot, consciousness fragmenting again under the combined stress of combat and the shock of their 2 millennia displacement, decides that if they're going down, they're taking as many Xenos with them as possible. They activate the reactor's overload sequence, a last resort option that turns the Dreadnought into a massive bomb. The Orks, seeing the Dreadnought glow with increasing intensity as the reactor destabilizes, might realize what's happening, or they might not. Orks aren't great at tactical withdrawal, and the excitement of finally bringing down such an impressive enemy might override any survival instinct. Either way, when the reactor goes critical, the explosion is devastating. Everything within a 100-meter radius is vaporized instantly. The structure they're fighting in, whether it's a space hulk or a ruined fortress, suffers catastrophic damage, and both the Dreadnought and the Orks cease to exist in a final blaze of atomic fire. It's a grim ending, but one that fits the grim-dark nature of Warhammer 40,000. The ancient warrior, lost for 2,000 years, wakes only to die again, this time taking their enemies with them in a final act of spite. The Orks get what they always wanted, a proper scrap with a worthy opponent, ending in glorious violence. There are no winners in such an outcome, only the cold certainty that duty has been served and the Emperor's enemies have been purged. The second outcome is Ork victory through sheer attrition. Despite the Dreadnought's superior firepower and armor, the Orks simply have too many bodies to throw at the problem. Wave after wave of boys crash against the ancient war machine, each wave doing a little more damage, wearing down the armor, depleting the ammunition, overwhelming the defensive systems. Eventually, something critical fails. A leg servo gives out, bringing the Dreadnought crashing to the ground. The weapons run dry of ammunition or suffer mechanical failure. The reactor shuts down, unable to sustain power output any longer. When the Dreadnought falls, the Orks swarm over it like ants on a carcass. Mechs begin tearing it apart immediately, salvaging anything that looks valuable or interesting. The weapons are claimed as trophies. The armor plating is torn off to be repurposed for Ork vehicles or fortifications, and eventually they reach the sarcophagus. What the Orks find inside would horrify any human. The remnants of what was once a space marine, reduced to barely more than a torso and head, suspended in chemical fluids and connected to the machine through hundreds of cables and tubes. For the Orks, it's just another curiosity, quickly discarded as they focus on the more interesting mechanical components. The pilot, if they're still conscious at this point, experiences their final moments in absolute horror. Defeated by Xenos, their sacred chassis defiled and destroyed, dying alone among enemies with no hope of recovery or even a decent burial. It's perhaps the worst possible ending for a space marine, and for a Dreadnought who has served for 2,000 years, it's a tragedy of cosmic proportions. The third outcome is Dreadnought victory, followed by escape. The pilot, despite their disorientation and the shock of their displacement in time, is still a space marine. They're trained to fight against impossible odds, to adapt to unexpected circumstances, to survive when survival seems impossible. As the battle rages, they begin to formulate a tactical plan. The Orks are numerous but disorganized. They're fighting with enthusiasm rather than strategy. If the Dreadnought can break through their lines, create enough chaos to disrupt their coordination, they might be able to disengage and escape. It's not an honorable retreat. Space Marines don't retreat. But tactical withdrawal to regroup and reassess is perfectly acceptable doctrine. The Dreadnought fights its way to whatever passes for an exit, leaving a trail of Ork corpses in its wake. Once clear of the immediate combat zone, it moves as quickly as its damaged chassis allows, putting distance between itself and the warband. The Orks might pursue initially, but their natural tendency toward infighting means that eventually they'll get distracted, squabbling over the loot from the battle and stop chasing. This outcome leaves the Dreadnought free, but raises a host of new questions. Where do they go? How do they contact the Imperium? Do they even want to? After 2,000 years, they're a ghost, a relic from a forgotten age. Reintegration into Imperial military forces would be difficult, if not impossible. But the alternative is wandering the galaxy alone, an ancient warrior searching for purpose in a universe that has moved on without them. The fourth, and perhaps most interesting outcome, is Ork capture and looting without complete destruction. The Orks managed to disable the Dreadnought without killing the pilot or destroying the chassis beyond repair. This could happen if the war boss, recognizing the value of such an impressive machine, orders his boys to capture it alive, or whatever the Ork equivalent of that concept is. What follows is a bizarre scenario where Ork mechs attempt to repair and repurpose the Dreadnought, possibly with the pilot still inside and conscious. The mechs would be fascinated by the technology, their instinctive understanding of mechanics telling them that this is good stuff, really good stuff, better than most of what they've looted before. They'd start tinkering, replacing damaged components with Ork equivalents, adding custom modifications, painting it in Ork colors. The pilot, trapped and helpless, would have to endure the ultimate humiliation, being turned into an Ork war machine. The psychological trauma would be immense, possibly breaking even a transhuman mind. And yet, there's a horrible possibility that the WAG field, combined with Ork mechanical ingenuity, might actually make it work. The Dreadnought could end up fighting alongside Orks, its weapon system slaved to Ork control, its ancient chassis repurposed for Xenos warfare. It's a fate worse than death, and one that highlights the dark humor that sometimes creeps into Warhammer 40,000's grimdark setting. The final outcome to consider is intervention by a third party. Perhaps the fighting attracts the attention of other forces in the area. If this is happening on a space hulk, there might be Genestealers who view both the Dreadnought and the Orks as prey, or Chaos forces who see opportunity in the chaos, or even other Imperial forces who investigate the source of the disturbance. Imagine a squad of Adeptus Astartes Terminators boarding the space hulk on a completely unrelated mission, following the sounds of combat to find an ancient Dreadnought of their own chapter, locked in battle with Orks. The reunion would be both joyous and tragic. Joy at finding a long-lost brother, tragedy at what has happened to him and what he's endured. Or consider an Inquisitor with an interest in archaeotech, who recognizes the Dreadnought as a relic of immense value and orders it captured for study, regardless of the pilot's wishes. The Inquisition has a long history of treating Space Marine equipment as assets to be acquired rather than sacred relics to be honored. Each of these outcomes tells a different story, reflects different aspects of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and highlights different themes: duty and sacrifice, the horror of eternal service, the unstoppable nature of the Ork threat, the tragedy of being lost in time, the aftermath, echoes of battle. Regardless of which outcome occurs, the aftermath of such an encounter reverberates through both the Ork warband and, potentially, the wider Imperium. Each ending leaves its own unique legacy, shapes the future in ways both large and small, and adds another chapter to the endless saga of war that defines the 41st millennium. If the Dreadnought self-destructs, taking most of the Ork warband with it, the survivors tell stories of the encounter for years to come. Orks love a good scrap, and this was definitely that. The tale of the big metal Hume that woke up from a long sleep and fought like a daemon before exploding in a massive fireball becomes part of the warband's oral history. It might even inspire some of the mechs to try recreating that final explosion, leading to experiments with explosives that are dangerous even by Ork standards. The explosion itself would be visible for kilometers, a miniature sun blooming in whatever structure contains the battle. If this occurs on a space hulk, the detonation could trigger a chain reaction of failing systems, causing sections of the hulk to explosively decompress or collapse inward. Entire decks might be scoured clean of life, the blast wave propagating through corridors and chambers until it dissipates or encounters structural barriers strong enough to contain it. For the Orks who survive at a safe distance, the explosion is the best possible ending to the story. What could be more glorious than an enemy so dedicated to the fight that they turn themselves into a bomb rather than accept defeat? It's the sort of thing that makes other Orks nod in respect, even as they're being blown backward by the shockwave. The war boss might even decree that future battles should end with similar explosions, leading to all sorts of interesting experiments with overloaded reactors and unstable ammunition. In the months and years following such an event, scavengers brave enough to approach the blast site might find interesting salvage. Fragments of the Dreadnought's armor, transformed into radioactive shrapnel by the explosion, could be collected and used in weapon construction. Ork mechs might study the patterns of destruction, learning valuable lessons about explosive force and structural failure. The very ground where the battle occurred becomes a monument, not through intentional memorialization, but through the simple fact that the radiation and residual destruction make it impossible to completely reclaim. The site of the battle becomes a crater, radioactive and unstable, avoided even by Orks who normally show no concern for their own safety. If this happened on a space hulk, the explosion might have damaged the hulk's structural integrity, causing entire sections to decompress or collapse. Future explorers, whether Imperial salvage teams or more Ork scavengers, find scattered debris and elevated radiation readings, but little else to indicate what happened there. In the wider Imperium, if anyone even learns of the incident, it's recorded as just another Space Marine casualty, another hero lost to the endless war. The Dreadnought's chapter, if it still exists, might never know what happened to their ancient brother. He remains missing, status unknown, his final sacrifice unrecorded and unremembered, except by the enemies he took with him into death. If the Orks win through attrition and tear the Dreadnought apart, they gain significant loot and prestige. The weapons are distributed among the warband's most prestigious fighters. The armor plating is used to reinforce vehicles or fortifications. The reactor, if it can be salvaged, powers some new Ork creation, probably something that explodes spectacularly during its first field test. The war boss who led the attack gains considerable status from defeating such an impressive enemy. Other Orks want to join his warband, drawn by his reputation for finding good scraps. The warband grows larger, more dangerous, potentially becoming the nucleus of a full WAG that threatens nearby Imperial worlds. For the Imperium, the loss is registered, if it's registered at all, as another data point in the endless accounting of war. A Dreadnought that has been missing for 2,000 years is already written off in most records. Its actual destruction changes nothing in the grand scheme of Imperial bureaucracy. But for the Dreadnought's chapter, if they somehow learn of their brother's fate, there might be a desire for vengeance. A campaign is planned. Forces are mobilized. The Orks who defiled their ancient warrior will be made to pay, even if it takes decades or centuries to track them down. If the Dreadnought escapes and survives, the story becomes more complicated. The ancient warrior must now navigate a galaxy that has changed beyond recognition. They might try to contact their chapter, only to discover that it was destroyed centuries ago in some catastrophic campaign. They might find that their chapter still exists, but has changed so dramatically that they no longer recognize it. The doctrines have evolved. The tactics have adapted to new threats. The very culture of the chapter has transformed over 2 millennia of warfare. Integration would be difficult. How do you explain a gap of 2,000 years to warriors who view continuity and tradition as sacred? How do you function as part of a chapter when you remember brothers who are legendary heroes to current members, but who are just regular Marines to you? The psychological burden would be immense, piled on top of all the other trauma that Dreadnoughts endure. Some might choose to remain independent, wandering the galaxy as a lone warrior, taking on missions of their own choosing, fighting the Emperor's enemies wherever they find them. It's a lonely existence, but perhaps no more lonely than the sleep they've already endured. The most disturbing outcome, where the Dreadnought is captured and repurposed by Orks, creates ripples of horror throughout any Imperial forces that discover it. To see sacred Space Marine technology defiled in such a way, to witness an honored warrior enslaved to Xenos purposes, is an affront that demands immediate response. The Inquisition would become involved. Entire military campaigns might be launched with the specific goal of recovering or destroying the corrupted Dreadnought. If the pilot is still alive and conscious inside, if they can somehow signal their presence and identity, there would be debates about whether recovery and cleansing is possible, or if destruction is the only mercy. And throughout all of this, the Orks would continue using their new toy, delighted by how much destruction it causes, completely oblivious to the significance of what they've done, or the fury they've unleashed. If a third party intervenes, and the situation is resolved through their involvement, the outcome depends heavily on who intervenes and what their motives are. Rescue by fellow Space Marines leads to attempted rehabilitation, medical treatment, and hopefully some measure of peace for the ancient warrior. Capture by the Inquisition leads to interrogation, study, possible mind-wiping, if the Dreadnought is deemed compromised by their experiences. In any scenario, the story of a Dreadnought lost for 2,000 years and rediscovered by Orks serves as a microcosm of the larger themes that define Warhammer 40,000. It speaks to the horror of eternal service, the tragedy of being lost in time, the unstoppable nature of duty, and the grim inevitability of war. It reminds us that in the darkness of the far future, there are worse fates than death, and that sometimes the greatest heroes endure the greatest suffering. The galaxy is vast and uncaring. Empires rise and fall. Billions live and die. And somewhere in the darkness, ancient warriors wait in their sleep, prisoners of duty and honor, dreaming dreams that might be nightmares or might be nothing at all, until, perhaps, the day when they are found. Conclusion: the horror and glory of forever war. The scenario of Orks discovering a Dreadnought that has been asleep for 2,000 years is more than just an interesting tactical situation or a cool battle scene. It's a lens through which we can examine some of the most fundamental themes of the Warhammer 40,000 universe: the cost of duty, the horror of immortality, the nature of consciousness, and the endless cycle of war that defines the 41st millennium. The Dreadnought represents the ultimate expression of Imperial military philosophy. Duty does not end with death. Service continues beyond the limits of mortal flesh. The Emperor's work is never finished, and therefore his servants must never rest. It's presented as an honor, and in the Imperium's grim calculus, perhaps it is. But viewed from outside that cultural context, it's revealed as the horror it truly is: consciousness imprisoned, identity slowly eroded, existence reduced to periods of violence separated by vast expanses of dreamless sleep. Consider what this means on a human level, if such considerations still apply to beings as altered as Dreadnought pilots. Every time they wake, they must reconstruct their sense of self from fragmentary memories and degraded neural pathways. Every time they fight, They expend not just ammunition and power, but pieces of their identity, sacrificing another fragment of who they once were to fulfill their duty. Every time they return to sleep, they risk never waking again, or worse, waking as something less than they were before. The passage of 2,000 years compounds this horror exponentially. It's not just a matter of missing out on the passage of time, though that alone would be devastating. It's the complete erasure of context. Every reference point the pilot had for understanding their place in the universe is gone. The campaigns they fought in are ancient history. The enemies they faced have been replaced by new threats. The very language might have evolved enough that their speech patterns seem archaic. They are a ghost, haunting a galaxy that has moved on without them. Yet the tragedy is that this ghost still has duties to fulfill, still has capabilities that make them valuable as a weapon. The Imperium, in its ruthless pragmatism, would not hesitate to deploy such a warrior despite their psychological trauma. They are still a dreadnought. They can still fight. That's all that matters in the cold equations of eternal war. The Orks, by contrast, represent a kind of terrible freedom. They exist purely for war, yes, but they enjoy it. They revel in violence, find joy in combat, celebrate each battle as a grand adventure. They are not burdened by duty or honor or the weight of 10,000 years of tradition. They fight because they want to, because it's fun, because it's what they were made for. And they embrace that purpose without question or regret. When these two forces collide, when the ancient warrior meets the savage scavenger, the encounter is both tragic and inevitable. The dreadnought, lost for 2 millennia, wakes to find that nothing has changed in the fundamental sense. There are still enemies to fight. There is still duty to fulfill. The specific details are different. The galaxy has moved on, but the war continues as it always has and always will. For a being whose entire existence has been reduced to this one purpose, there is perhaps a kind of comfort in that continuity. The Orks, meanwhile, have found the sort of entertainment they live for. A proper scrap with a worthy opponent, the chance to loot impressive technology, the opportunity to test their strength against one of the Imperium's most formidable war machines. Win or lose, they're having the time of their lives, because Orks measure success not in victory, but in how much fun they had getting there. This encounter also highlights the fundamental absurdity that underlies much of Warhammer 40,000's grimdark aesthetic. Here is a warrior who has served for millennia, who has endured suffering that would break any normal mind, who represents the absolute pinnacle of Imperial military might. And they're fighting Orks, who have turned scavenging into an art form, and whose technology works primarily because they believe it should. The juxtaposition of high tragedy and low comedy, of gothic horror and dark humor, is quintessentially 40k. There's something almost poetic about this clash of philosophies and technologies. The dreadnought represents order, structure, the accumulated technical knowledge of millennia of Imperial engineering. Every component has been designed with precision, every system optimized for maximum efficiency, every protocol tested and refined through countless battles. It is a masterwork of human achievement, a testament to what can be accomplished when purpose and technology align. The Orks represent chaos, improvisation, and the defiance of conventional physics through sheer belief. Their weapons are held together with wire and hope. Their tactics consist largely of running toward the enemy while shooting. Their entire civilization is built on the principle that if something is big enough and loud enough, it must be good. And yet, through the reality-warping power of the WAG field, this actually works. They can take Imperial technology, Eldar anti-gravity engines, Tau plasma weapons, Tyranid bioorganic components, and mash them all together into something that should fail immediately, but instead functions perfectly well, because the Orks believe it will. When these two approaches to warfare meet, the result is a battle that is simultaneously tragic and farcical, a collision of certainty and belief that produces violence on a scale that neither could achieve alone. the broader implications ripple outward. How many other dreadnoughts are lost in the void, waiting in darkness for discovery that may never come? How many ancient warriors sleep in forgotten tombs, on abandoned worlds, in the depths of space hulks, their service unremembered and their sacrifice unknown? The galaxy is vast, and the Imperium's records are incomplete at best. For every dreadnought that is honored and maintained by their chapter, there might be dozens or hundreds lost to time and misfortune. And what of the Orks? How much Imperial technology have they looted over the millennia? How many sacred relics have been defiled, repurposed, turned against their creators? The thought is disturbing, but it's also a reminder of the Ork threat. They are not just brutal warriors. They are scavengers and engineers, capable of turning the Imperium's own weapons against it through a combination of mechanical instinct and reality-warping belief. There's also something poignant about the idea of ancient and modern forces meeting in this way. The Dreadnought represents the past, a warrior from an age that no longer exists, carrying traditions and memories that have been lost to time. The Orks represent the eternal present, living entirely in the moment, unconcerned with history or future, focused only on the immediate excitement of the now. When these temporal philosophies collide, neither truly understands the other, and perhaps that's fitting. Understanding is not necessary for war. As we close this exploration of what happens when Orks find a dreadnought that's been asleep for 2,000 years, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. Is it better to die with honor or to serve forever in agony? Is consciousness preserved through such extended periods worth the suffering it entails? Can duty justify any cost, any sacrifice, any horror? The Imperium would answer yes without hesitation. But the answer is less clear when we examine it through the lens of the individual dreadnought, the warrior who has paid that price in full and continues to pay it with every moment of their existence. The story of such an encounter is ultimately a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that plays out millions of times across the galaxy in different forms and different contexts. It's the tragedy of the Imperium itself, an empire built on sacrifice, sustained by suffering, grinding forward through sheer force of will and the bodies of those who serve it. It's the tragedy of war without end, of duty without release, of service without reward. And yet, there is also glory in it. The glory of the warrior who refuses to quit, even when every rational consideration says they should. The glory of duty maintained across millennia. The glory of standing against the darkness one more time, and then another time, and another, forever if necessary, because someone must hold the line and no one else will do it. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also warriors, ancient and proud, sleeping in the darkness, waiting for the call to battle that will inevitably come. And when it does, they will rise, they will fight, and they will fulfill their duty, no matter the cost. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's most fascinating scenarios, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button if you want to see more explorations of the 40k universe, and let me know in the comments what topics you'd like me to cover next. There are countless stories waiting to be told in the grim darkness of the far future, and we've only just begun to explore them. Until next time, remember, in the darkness of the void, ancient warriors wait, and when they wake, the galaxy trembles. For the Emperor, always for the Emperor.